Instructor Vex Newell had what could charitably be called a flair for the dramatic, which was impressive considering his species communicated primarily through harmonic crystal resonance. When he spoke through the universal translator, every word carried the weight of absolute certainty, the kind that only came from never having been truly, spectacularly wrong. "Observe," he announced to the mixed-species classroom aboard Kepler Station, his crystalline form refracting the overhead lights into patterns that supposedly conveyed additional meaning. Nobody had bothered to learn the light language. The primitive Earth species and their obsession with mythological warfare. 23 cadets from 12 different worlds leaned forward with varying degrees of anatomical possibility. The Zephyrians tilted their serpentine necks, the Corvin clicked their mandibles in what passed for academic interest, and the gas-form ethereals simply paid attention, which was about as physical as they got. In the back row, human cadet Torres continued taking meticulous notes on a tablet that looked decidedly more advanced than regulation issue. His presence in the class was something of an administrative curiosity. Humans weren't supposed to be studying their own species' military failures. But Torres had specifically requested the course, and his academic scores were irritatingly impeccable. "Their historical records," Vex Null continued, manipulating the holographic display with practiced flourish, "reveal a species fundamentally divorced from reality. Consider this absurd tale of 300 warriors defeating an army of millions." The display showed ancient Earth imagery, bronze weapons, leather armor, men with impressive facial hair shouting dramatically at overwhelming odds. "Thermopylae," whispered Cadet Rex 9, her Corvin translation implants making the human word sound like grinding metal. "The madness is almost poetic." "Precisely." Vex Null's harmonics conveyed smug satisfaction. "Or examine this primitive mythology about a small individual defeating a giant warrior using simple projectile physics. They actually believed this constituted divine intervention." The hologram shifted to show a young human with a sling, facing something that looked like it could bench press a shuttle. "David and Goliath," Torres murmured, not looking up from his notes. "Over 97% of viewers here are watching without subscribing. Don't be one of them. Hit that subscribe button right now and join the journey. Every click helps us grow stronger, and you'll never miss the next epic story." Several cadets turned to stare. It was the first time he'd spoken during the entire semester. "Indeed, Cadet Torres. I'm pleased you recognize these fabrications." Vex Null's crystals brightened with approval. "Your species' tendency to mythologize simple military encounters demonstrates the psychological wounds left by their rapid defeat during first contact protocols." The room filled with the various sounds of interspecies agreement, chittering, harmonic humming, and what the Vorthan representative did that approximated a supportive grunt. When faced with superior technology and strategic thinking, Vex Null continued, humanity resorted to these fantasy narratives as coping mechanisms. Their entire military philosophy became centered around impossible victories against overwhelming odds, clear evidence of a species unable to accept their limitations. Torres finally looked up from his tablet, expression politely curious. "Fascinating analysis, Instructor. I'm gratified you appreciate the psychological nuance, Cadet. The human defeat serves as an excellent case study in species adaptation to military irrelevance." "Oh, absolutely. The mythological framework is particularly interesting." Torres leaned back in his chair with the casual confidence that made his instructors either love or hate him. "Tell me, when you prepared this lecture, did you work from the complete human historical database?" The question hung in the recycled air like an undetonated explosive. "I utilized all relevant materials, naturally." Vex Null's harmonics carried a barely perceptible defensive undertone. Relevant materials, Torres repeated thoughtfully. That's a wonderfully diplomatic phrase. Could you specify which database version you accessed? The other cadets exchanged glances. This was either about to become very educational or very uncomfortable. Possibly both. The standard Galactic Military Academy Historical Archive, obviously. Vex Null's crystals dimmed slightly. The same resource available to all instructors? Ah. Torres nodded with the kind of understanding that made people deeply nervous. The executive summary version. Excellent choice for introductory coursework. Executive summary? Cadet Rex 9's mandibles clicked rapidly. Are there multiple versions? Torres smiled. It was not a particularly reassuring expression. Well, the GMA archive contains what you might call the highlights reel of human military history. About 14,000 entries, if I recall correctly. Very manageable for survey courses. 14,000 is hardly a small sample, Vex Null protested. Oh, I completely agree. For most species, 14,000 military encounters would represent several millennia of comprehensive warfare. Torres pulled up something on his tablet. It's just that the complete human database contains roughly 12.7 million documented conflicts. The silence that followed was the kind typically reserved for moments when everyone suddenly realized they might have made a terrible mistake. 12.7. Cadet Vorth, representing the peaceful arbiter species, seemed to have difficulty processing the number. Million? Give or take a few 100,000. Record-keeping was inconsistent during the pre-digital periods. Torres continued reading from his tablet with academic detachment. The GMA summary focuses primarily on mythological references and defeats, which makes sense for a basic overview. Much more efficient than covering the complete tactical archive. Vex Null's harmonic output became noticeably strained. Surely you're not suggesting the Academy's military historians overlooked significant data. Overlooked? Oh no, I'm sure it was a deliberate editorial choice. Torres finally looked up, expression perfectly innocent. After all, who has time to review 12.7 million military encounters when you can focus on the really important mythological stories about impossible victories? The implications hung in the air like a toxic cloud. Cadet Torres, Vex Null said carefully, are you questioning the accuracy of Academy-approved curriculum materials? Torres appeared to consider this seriously. I wouldn't dream of questioning the accuracy of what you've presented, Instructor. Your analysis of the selected materials was quite thorough. The pause that followed was pregnant with unspoken implications. However, Torres continued with the mild tone of someone about to detonate a diplomatic incident. Since you've declared the case study complete, I was wondering if you'd finished reading the source file. Every being in the classroom became very still. In the ethereal representative's case, this involved temporarily achieving a state that might have violated several laws of physics. The complete file? Vex Null's crystals flickered uncertainly. Torres held up his tablet, screen showing what appeared to be a very, very long document index. The full human military history archive. I have it here, if you'd like to cross-reference your lecture materials. Cadet Rex 9 leaned forward with predatory interest. How long would it take to review the complete archive? Torres consulted his tablet with professorial attention to detail. At standard reading speed? Roughly 437 years, though that's assuming 8 hours of study per day with weekends off. More if you wanted to include the tactical analysis supplements. The classroom had achieved a level of quiet usually associated with libraries, morgues, or moments before someone got expelled from military academy. Of course, Torres added helpfully, I completely understand why the course materials focused on the mythological elements. much more manageable scope for a semester-long survey, and the defeat narrative provides such a clean conclusion. Vex Null's harmonic output had become barely audible. You seem to have strong opinions about curriculum design, Cadet. Not at all, Instructor. I'm simply curious about methodology. Torres smiled again, and this time it definitely qualified as dangerous. For instance, when you mentioned that story about 300 warriors holding off millions, did the summary mention what they were actually trying to accomplish? The question hit the room like a tactical strike. They were attempting to achieve victory against impossible odds, Vex Null managed. As I explained, fascinating interpretation. According to the complete tactical analysis, they were implementing a strategic delay operation to allow evacuation of civilian populations and proper positioning of naval assets. Torres spoke with the casual tone of someone reading a grocery list. The 300 weren't trying to win. They were buying time, and they succeeded perfectly. Silence. But I'm sure that detail was probably in the supplementary materials you didn't have time to cover, Torres added generously. The class period still had 17 minutes remaining. 17 very long minutes during which Instructor Vex Null would have to continue teaching a lesson that had just been systematically dismantled by one of his own students. Torres returned to taking notes, apparently unaware that he'd just committed what amounted to academic homicide. His tablet stylus moved steadily across the screen, recording what would undoubtedly become the most memorable lecture of the semester. For all the wrong reasons. 17 minutes stretched like taffy in a gravity well. Vex Null had two choices: pretend nothing had happened and continue with his prepared material, or acknowledge that his star pupil had just torpedoed the entire curriculum. Being a crystalline life form with roughly 3,000 years of academic experience, he chose the third option: dignified deflection. While Cadet Torres raises interesting questions about source material comprehensiveness, Vex Null began, his harmonics recovering some of their authoritative resonance, the fundamental psychological patterns remain valid. Human mythology consistently demonstrates— Sorry, Instructor. Torres raised his hand with polite persistence. Could you clarify what makes these accounts mythological? The other cadets perked up. This wasn't going to be 17 minutes of awkward silence after all. This was going to be 17 minutes of watching their instructor get systematically dissected by a student who apparently knew more about the subject than he did. The obvious fantastical elements, Vex Null replied, gesturing toward the holographic display still showing the Thermopylae scene. 300 individuals against millions. The mathematical impossibility speaks for itself. Absolutely. The math is fascinating. Torres consulted his tablet again. The Persian force under Xerxes numbered approximately 120,000 combat troops, plus support personnel. Herodotus inflated the numbers for dramatic effect, standard practice in ancient historical accounts. The actual tactical situation involved a narrow coastal pass where numerical superiority became irrelevant. Cadet Vorth's translator made confused beeping sounds. You're saying the ancient human historians deliberately exaggerated their own accounts? Constantly. Earth literature is packed with unreliable narrators, propaganda, and artistic embellishment. Separating historical fact from literary interpretation requires cross-referencing archaeological evidence, contemporary sources, and tactical analysis. Torres smiled at Vorth's bewildered expression. Most species assume written records represent literal truth. Humans wrote fiction for entertainment and called it history when it made a better story. Rex 9's mandibles clicked rapidly. That seems deliberately deceptive. Only if you don't understand the cultural context. Humans developed multiple simultaneous information frameworks, religious texts, historical records, tactical manuals, entertainment media, and propaganda materials. They expected their audiences to distinguish between them. Torres turned to Vex Null. The GMA summary files don't include the cultural interpretation guides, do they? Vex Null's crystals dimmed noticeably. Cultural interpretation is beyond the scope of military analysis. Understandable limitation, though it does make the Thermopylae example more interesting when you realize it wasn't about defeating the Persian army at all. Torres pulled up what appeared to be a tactical breakdown on his tablet. King Leonidas was implementing a holding action while the Athenian fleet positioned for naval engagement at Salamis. The 300 held the pass for exactly as long as the strategic plan required. A successful military operation? The ethereal representative's translated voice carried distinctive confusion. Completely successful. The Persians won the battle and lost the war. The Greek city-states achieved their strategic objectives through coordinated land and naval operations, exactly as planned. Torres looked around the classroom with mild curiosity. Did anyone think the Greeks expected 300 people to defeat the entire Persian Empire in single combat? The silence was deafening. Moving on, Vex Null said quickly, manipulating the display to show the David and Goliath imagery. This primitive mythology about divine intervention in personal combat. Oh, that's a fun one. Torres interrupted with genuine enthusiasm. Classic asymmetric warfare demonstration. Could we examine the tactical specifics? Several cadets exchanged glances. Apparently, Torres had opinions about everything. The tactical specifics? Vex Null sounded like someone being offered a live grenade. The sling projectile system. Humans developed remarkably sophisticated ballistic weapons using primitive materials. Torres gestured toward the hologram. A properly constructed sling could achieve muzzle velocities exceeding 30 meters per second. Combined with dense projectile materials and accurate targeting, you're looking at significant kinetic impact potential. Cadet Zeph Tool, whose species had never developed projectile weapons, leaned forward with scientific interest. The small individual could actually harm the larger opponent? Easily. The human brain case is particularly vulnerable to blunt force trauma. A stone projectile impacting cranial bone at sufficient velocity would cause immediate incapacitation or death. Torres spoke with the clinical detachment of someone reading equipment specifications. Plus, the larger opponent appears to be wearing heavy armor, which suggests limited mobility and visibility restrictions. You're describing calculated murder, Rex 9 observed. I'm describing standard infantry tactics. Humans spent roughly 6,000 years perfecting techniques for killing each other with improvised materials. Torres consulted his tablet again. The sling remained a primary military weapon through most of their classical period. Roman auxiliary units included specialized slingers well into the imperial era. Vex Null tried to regain control of his derailing lecture. Regardless of technical feasibility, the mythological framework clearly indicates. What mythological framework? Torres looked genuinely puzzled. The David account appears in Hebrew historical texts alongside genealogies, legal codes, and contemporary political records. It's presented as documented fact, not religious allegory. But surely the divine intervention aspect. Where? Torres scrolled through something on his tablet. David credits his deity with providing the opportunity, but the actual combat description is purely tactical. Projectile weapon versus armored opponent in single combat. Standard challenge duel protocols for Bronze Age tribal warfare. The classroom had achieved that peculiar quiet that suggested everyone was learning things they weren't entirely comfortable knowing. The summary materials indicated supernatural elements, Vex Null protested weakly. Probably translation artifacts. Ancient Hebrew contains multiple terms for divine involvement that don't correspond directly to supernatural intervention. Torres looked sympathetic. Without cultural linguistics background, it's easy to misinterpret ritualized combat accounts as fantasy literature. Cadet Vorth raised a tentative appendage. Are you suggesting that human historical records are more accurate than our analysis indicated? I'm suggesting that analyzing human historical records without understanding human cultural context is like trying to perform surgery with a mining laser. Torres turned his tablet toward the class, showing what appeared to be a very complex flowchart. Human information systems evolved multiple parallel truth frameworks: religious truth, historical truth, scientific truth, legal truth, artistic truth, all simultaneously valid within different contexts. That seems unnecessarily complicated, Zeftul observed. Completely unnecessary. Most species develop unified truth frameworks that eliminate contextual ambiguity. Torres smiled. Humans apparently found unified truth systems boring. Vex Null made one last desperate attempt to salvage his curriculum. Even accepting your revisionist interpretations, the fundamental pattern remains. Humans consistently mythologized their military encounters rather than— Actually, Torres interrupted gently, could we examine that assumption? Because the really interesting question isn't whether humans mythologized their military history. It's why the GMA database classified documented historical events as mythology in the first place. And there it was, the question that turned the entire discussion inside out. Every cadet in the classroom suddenly understood that they weren't just learning about human military history. They were discovering that their own educational system might have some very significant gaps in its analytical methodology. Torres waited patiently while this realization settled over the room like radioactive dust. I mean, he added conversationally, someone had to make the editorial decision to categorize these accounts as mythological rather than historical. I'm curious about the criteria they used. The chronometer on the wall indicated 3 minutes remaining in the class period. 3 minutes during which Instructor Vex Null could either admit his curriculum was fundamentally flawed or double down on academic authority. Being a creature of crystalline structure and rigid thinking, he chose the path of institutional defensiveness. The classification criteria are established by the Galactic Historical Commission, Vex Null announced with renewed confidence. I hardly think a first-year cadet is qualified to question their methodology. Torres nodded respectfully. Absolutely correct, Instructor. I wouldn't presume to question the Commission's expertise. He paused, tablet balanced casually in his palm. Though I did notice some interesting discrepancies when I cross-referenced their human database with the source materials. Several cadets groaned audibly. Apparently, Torres had more ammunition. Cross-referenced with what source materials? Vex Null's harmonic output carried the brittle quality of someone watching their reputation crumble in real time. The complete human military archives. All 847 terabytes of compiled data. Torres held up his tablet like he was discussing lunch plans. I downloaded the public access version from the Terran Historical Preservation Network. Took about 6 hours. 847 terabytes? Cadet Zeftul's species communicated partially through color changes, and his skin had shifted to what appeared to be distressed yellow. For one species' military history? That's just the indexed material. The raw archives include battlefield recordings, tactical communications, supply logistics, casualty reports, post-action analyses, and psychological profiles of command personnel. Torres scrolled through his tablet with professional detachment. Humans documented everything, obsessively. Rex 9's mandibles clicked in what her species considered deep thought. How does 847 terabytes compare to the GMA summary? Torres consulted his screen. The Academy database represents approximately 0.03% of available data, which is actually quite reasonable for survey-level coursework. 0.03%, Forth repeated slowly, of the total information. Give or take a few decimal places, yes? The silence that followed wasn't the comfortable quiet of academic contemplation. It was the uncomfortable quiet of students realizing their education might have some rather significant gaps. What kind of material got excluded? This question came from Cadet Rem 8, whose species rarely spoke during class, but apparently found the current discussion sufficiently intriguing to break their customary silence. Torres brightened like someone who'd been waiting for exactly this question. Oh, the usual editorial priorities. The GMA database focuses on defeats, tactical failures, and what the Commission classified as delusional victory narratives. The excluded material tends toward successful operations, strategic innovations, and technological developments. Such as? Vex Null had apparently decided that dignified silence was no longer an option. Well, there's the complete nuclear weapons development program. Humans created devices capable of rendering their entire planet uninhabitable, then spent 60 years not using them. Torres spoke with the casual tone of someone discussing weather patterns. The psychological warfare studies are fascinating. They developed propaganda techniques so effective, they had to create counter-propaganda to protect their own populations from their own materials. Zeftul's skin shifted to alarmed orange. They weaponized their own communication systems? Extensively. Military deception, strategic misdirection, battlefield psychology, civilian morale management. Humans treated information as a primary weapons system. Torres scrolled through more data. The medical warfare section is particularly interesting. They developed biological weapons, then developed cures for biological weapons that didn't exist yet. Cures for non-existent diseases? The ethereal representative sounded confused. Preventive vaccine development. They identified potential biological threat vectors and created countermeasures before anyone actually weaponized those vectors. Torres looked up from his tablet. Humans approached warfare by assuming their opponents would eventually develop every possible weapon, then developing defenses accordingly. The classroom had achieved that peculiar atmosphere of academic horror that occurred when students discovered their professors had been teaching them approximately nothing. This material wasn't classified? Vex Null asked weakly. Public domain. Available through standard data requests from any Terran educational institution. Torres held up his tablet again. I can forward the access protocols to anyone interested. Takes about 15 minutes to set up an account. Rex 9 leaned forward with predatory intensity. You're saying we could have accessed this information at any time? Any time for the past 43 years. Humans released their complete military archives when they joined the Galactic Cooperative. Transparency Initiative, I believe they called it. Cadet Rem 8 made the soft whistling sound that indicated deep thought among their species. Why would they release classified military information? They said something about educational cooperation and promoting interspecies understanding. Torres shrugged. Though it's worth noting that the archives only cover military operations through their pre-contact period. Nothing about current capabilities or strategic planning. Current capabilities? Vex Null's crystals flickered nervously. Well, presumably they've continued developing military technology since joining galactic civilization. The archives end at first contact, when they were officially designated as a defeated species and integrated into the cooperative. Torres paused thoughtfully. Though I suppose their current military status isn't really relevant to historical analysis. The chronometer showed 30 seconds remaining in the class period. 30 seconds during which every cadet in the room was wondering what else they didn't know about the species they'd been taught to dismiss as harmless primitives. For tomorrow's assignment, Torres continued helpfully, should we review more material from the complete archives? I noticed the GMA database doesn't include any information about their space warfare development, planetary defense systems, or the rather impressive collection of extinction-level weapons they apparently built during their isolation period. What? Vorth's translator struggled with the implications. Oh, that's probably advanced coursework material. Don't worry about it for now. Torres began packing his tablet as the chronometer reached 0. Though if anyone wants to review the supplementary materials, I can share the access protocols. The human archives include helpful search functions and automated translation systems. As cadets began filing out of the classroom, several lingered to request Torres's contact information. The ethereal representative asked about data transfer protocols. Zeftool wanted to know about the nuclear weapons development timeline. Even normally silent REM-8 inquired about accessing the biological warfare countermeasures research. Instructor Vex Null remained at his lectern, crystalline form dimmed to barely perceptible illumination, contemplating the wreckage of his carefully prepared curriculum. Torres paused at the classroom door and turned back with an expression of helpful concern. Instructor? For next week's examination, should we prepare questions based on the GMA summary materials, or would you prefer we work from the complete archives? The question hung in the recycled air like an unexploded ordnance device. I'll review the available options and provide guidance, Vex Null managed. Torres smiled. Excellent. I think everyone will find the additional material quite illuminating. He left the classroom whistling something that sounded vaguely like a funeral march. 6 months later, the Galactic Military Academy had undergone what administrators diplomatically termed curriculum optimization. Less diplomatically, it resembled an institution recovering from academic food poisoning. Assistant Instructor Torres stood before a packed lecture hall, addressing the most popular elective in Academy history. Unconventional victory conditions had a waiting list 3 semesters long, and several faculty members audited the sessions with the dedicated enthusiasm of people discovering their education had been incomplete. Today we're examining strategic misdirection, Torres announced to his audience of 47 cadets, representing 19 species. Specifically, the advantages of being systematically underestimated by potential opponents. Former instructor Vex Null, now administrative coordinator Vex Null, watched from the back row with the hollow expression of someone whose worldview had been professionally demolished. He attended every session, taking notes with the desperate intensity of a student cramming for final examinations. Consider the theoretical scenario, Torres continued, manipulating the holographic display with practiced ease. Species A encounters Species B during initial contact protocols. Species A possesses overwhelming technological superiority. Species B appears primitive, disorganized, and militarily insignificant. What's the optimal strategy for Species B? Cadet Rex 9, now a second-year student with significantly improved critical thinking skills, raised her appendage. Immediate surrender to minimize casualties? Classic approach. Safe, rational, predictable. Torres nodded approvingly. What else? Guerrilla resistance, suggested Zeftool, whose skin had shifted to thoughtful green. Asymmetric warfare to offset technological disadvantages. Excellent tactical thinking. Other options? Cadet Vorth, who had developed an alarming enthusiasm for military theory, raised multiple appendages simultaneously. Diplomatic negotiation for favorable surrender terms. All solid conventional responses. Torres smiled with the expression that had become legendary among Academy students. Anyone want to suggest something unconventional? Silence stretched across the lecture hall. 47 cadets and one administratively demoted instructor contemplated alternatives to logical military strategy. Lose deliberately, offered Rem 8 from the middle section. Explain that reasoning. If Species A expects Species B to fight desperately, losing quickly might seem suspicious. But if Species B fights competently but loses inevitably, Species A assumes they understand Species B's capabilities. Fascinating analysis. Continue. Rem 8's species rarely spoke at length, but Torres had that effect on students. Species A categorizes Species B as defeated, but not broken, suitable for integration rather than elimination. Species B gains access to galactic civilization, while maintaining Species A's assumption of superiority. The lecture hall buzzed with various forms of interspecies discussion. Several cadets were taking furious notes. Outstanding strategic thinking. Torres turned to address the full assembly. Now let's examine how this theoretical scenario might work in practice. The holographic display shifted to show familiar imagery. Earth's first contact with galactic civilization 43 years ago. Most of the cadets had never seen the complete documentation. Humans engaged galactic cooperative forces in 17 separate conflicts over an 18-month period, Torres narrated, as the display showed tactical summaries. They demonstrated sophisticated military technology, coordinated strategic planning, and remarkable adaptability under pressure. But they lost, Forth observed. They lost every single engagement, decisive defeats, minimal casualties, orderly surrenders. Torres highlighted specific battles on the display. Almost like they were following a predetermined script. Rex 9's mandibles clicked rapidly. You're suggesting the defeats were intentional? I'm suggesting we examine the evidence. Torres manipulated the display to show post-contact developments. After their defeat, humans were integrated into galactic civilization as a member species. They requested positions in education, research, and diplomatic services rather than demanding military positions. Reasonable career choices for a demilitarized species, Zeftul commented. Absolutely reasonable. Within 5 years, humans were teaching at major universities, conducting interspecies research, and serving as cultural liaisons for first contact protocols. The display showed organizational charts for various galactic institutions. They proved remarkably talented at helping other species understand complex information. Administrative Coordinator Vex Null raised a tentative appendage. Are you implying that humans deliberately sought educational positions? Torres turned to his former instructor with polite attention. What would you call it when a species specifically requests assignment to roles that provide comprehensive access to galactic military history, technological development, and strategic planning across all member civilizations? The lecture hall achieved perfect silence. Furthermore, Torres continued conversationally, they volunteered to teach other species how to think more critically about military analysis, encouraged students to question incomplete information, and systematically improved the analytical capabilities of future military leaders. That's... Cadet Rem 8 paused, translator struggling with the implications. That's a remarkably effective intelligence operation. Or educational reform, depending on your perspective. Torres smiled. The results are identical either way. Rex 9 leaned forward with predatory focus. How many humans currently serve in positions with access to sensitive, galactic information? Torres consulted his tablet, the same device he'd been using since his cadet days, though several students had noticed it contained significantly more data than regulation equipment should accommodate. Roughly 12,000 in educational institutions, 8,000 in research facilities, 4,000 in diplomatic services, and approximately 1,500 in what might generously be called administrative consulting positions. Torres looked up from his screen. Plus an undetermined number in private sector roles that interface with government contracts. Undetermined? Forth's translator carried undertones of alarm. Humans have this interesting cultural concept called resume networking. They maintain professional relationships across career transitions. A human teacher might have former students in military planning, current colleagues in technological research, and personal friends in diplomatic services. Torres shrugged. They claim it's purely social, but the information-sharing potential is remarkable. Administrative Coordinator Vex Null had achieved a crystalline formation that suggested existential dread. Are you telling this class that humanity infiltrated galactic civilization by losing a war? I'm telling this class that some defeats are indistinguishable from long-term strategic victories. Torres turned back to his students. The question isn't whether humans planned their integration into galactic society. The question is whether it matters. Of course it matters. Zeftul's skin flashed agitated yellow. If they deceived us about their intentions, what intentions? Torres looked genuinely curious. They requested educational and research positions. They've served in those positions with distinction for 4 decades. They've improved interspecies cooperation, enhanced critical thinking instruction, and helped other civilizations better understand military history. He paused thoughtfully. Exactly what harm were they supposed to have caused? The lecture hall filled with the sound of 47 students and one administratively demoted instructor contemplating this question. Perhaps, Torres suggested gently, the real lesson isn't about human deception. Perhaps it's about the value of questioning assumptions, seeking complete information, and recognizing that intelligence comes in many forms. He gathered his materials as the chronometer approached the end of class period. For next week's assignment, I'd like everyone to research one military defeat from your own species' history. Examine whether the defeat might have served strategic purposes the victors didn't recognize. Torres smiled with characteristic irony. You might be surprised what you discover when you read the complete files. As students filed out, discussing the session in animated voices across multiple species communication methods, Administrative Coordinator Vex Null approached the lectern with the careful movements of someone walking through a minefield. Assistant Instructor Torres, he said carefully, may I ask you a direct question? Of course, Coordinator. Was humanity's defeat in the First Galactic War actually a job interview? Torres considered this seriously. That's an interesting way to phrase it, though I prefer to think of it as a very thorough application process. He paused at the lecture hall exit and turned back with an expression of helpful concern. After all, Coordinator, what's the point of winning a war if it prevents you from teaching the next generation to think more clearly? The question echoed in the empty hall, like the sound of assumptions crumbling.